Welcome to another Jecks book commentary, I think is probably the best way of putting it. One of the things I say at the end of all videos is, if you've got any questions, let me know and I'll try to answer them. This is a question that I had a while ago, which is, how do I choose my characters? Wow, that varies. That varies really quite a lot. Somebody else also asked, is there any of my own personality in my characters? And the short answer to that one has to be yes, there is. Basically, I don't think you can write about anyone unless you've got quite a large chunk of their personality within you. The difficulty is obviously that if you're writing about mass murderers, that could be slightly confusing. The one book that got me more complaints from readers than any other was where I had a small case of adultery, and I was told by several readers he wouldn't have done that. Well, I disagree. The only thing that did irritate me though was that immediately afterwards I had several emails saying, well, was that you committed the adultery or your wife, Mr. Jecks? To which the answer is, no one has ever asked me, in all of the 34 books I've written about where I've had mass murderers involved, no one has ever asked me, well, were you the mass murderer or was your wife? Basically assume that if it's in a book it is supposed to be fiction, it's made up. Anyway, how do I choose my characters? It varies hugely. Sir Baldwin de Fernhill came about because I'd read a book about the Templars. I happened to be passing by Fursdon Manor, and I just had a thought that this was a manor that was first taken over by the Fursdon family in about 1280, and no one knows where the first Fursdon came from. And I thought, that's interesting actually. If he had turned up there in about 1314, 1315, he could have been a Templar. And that's what kicked off the whole idea about the Templar series. I had an idea about a Knight Templar who escaped the flames and everything, got back to England, and then what would he have done afterwards? Seems to me like a strong idea. When you look at Simon Puttock, that character came from the simple fact that I had Baldwin de Fernhill, who was a well-travelled chap. He had seen sieges, he'd fought in battles, he'd been trained as a Templar, he'd met the Pope, he'd seen how royal courts operated, papal courts operated. He would have been a really interesting guy. He had been also absolutely useless as an investigator because he had no idea about the locals or the local customs. So I thought I needed someone who was local. So after doing a bit of research, I discovered a guy called Stephen Puttock, who was a Thatcherite of the 1300s. He started off as a serf, so effectively a slave, but in the space of a short amount of time he managed to make himself, for the time, enormously wealthy. He owned several houses and cottages he was renting out, he owned several flocks of sheep, he owned sheepfolds that he could rent out. He was doing very nicely. Bishop liked him because the bishop earned 10% of everything. So that's where Simon Puttock came from, a straight copy of Stephen Puttock. But with other characters, I mean John de Sully, for example, that I use in my 100 Years War series. The first one, Fields of Glory, came out this year. The next one is coming out next year, oddly enough. And in that I used Sir John de Sully. Well, he came about because a good friend of mine is Nigel Guthrie, who's the rector of Crediton Church, and in Crediton Church, which we visit quite regularly, there is the figure of Sir John de Sully at the back. John de Sully was the Lord of the Manor of Rookford, which was Sandford in those days, and Iddesleigh, and he died in the late 1300s at the grand old age of 107. We know that because he was involved in a court case at the age of 105, and he was basically having to go through and detail all of the different battles that he fought in. We know that the last battle he fought in was when he was about 80, at the Battle of Najera in Spain with the Black Prince. So fascinating character. And in fact, not only was he authentically very old, I'll just grab this, he was also, as this demonstrates, one of the early Knights of the Garter. This is his brass plaque from his stall in St George's in Windsor. So he was a fascinating character. Other people I invented, people like Beringer Fripper in that book, came about purely as a process of invention, but I wanted to look in that book at the ordinary archer, the ordinary fighter. What sort of characters were they? Where did they come from? How did they fight? And Beringer Fripper seemed to me a very clear personality. He was fixed in my head really long before I started planning out the book. I just thought he'd be an interesting character, and then looking at the rest of the people in the Vintane, in the platoon, it was a case of taking the sort of people I wanted to depict, which were ordinary soldiers. So I read up a lot about First World War platoons, Second World War platoons, books like Quartered Safe Out Here, which I took an awful lot from, because that's one of the best written war memoirs of any soldier, I think. And that's really where the characters also are coming from. But is there any of those characters in me? Oh yes. Large chunks of the characters are all from what goes into my makeup. I think it's one of the best things about being an ex-salesman, is that you understand how people tick and how they work. And I think one of the reasons why I was a successful salesman was simply because I could get inside other people's heads, because I understood how they worked. So there you go, really. That's about it. Lots of thoughts there. Hopefully they're of some use. If they are of use, don't forget to share and comment and like and subscribe to the video, and recommend that your friends have a look at it as well. If you know anybody who's going to university soon, do please also tell them about this channel, because I'm going to be going through tips for students and tips on writing, hopefully to help students based on the tutorials I used to give at Exeter University up until this year. So hope you enjoyed it. Do like and subscribe, etc., and I'll speak to you soon. Take care.